The patrol began before dawn on March 17, 1943, in the North Atlantic, approximately 320 nautical miles west-northwest of Cape Finisterre, at 46 degrees 12 minutes north, 18 degrees 40 minutes west. The submarine was a fleet boat operating independently under standing orders to interdict enemy shipping lanes between the Bay of Biscay and the western approaches. Sea state at departure was Beaufort 5, with a long Atlantic swell running from the west at 2.5 to 3 meters. Wind was steady at 18 knots, bearing 270 degrees. Visibility at the surface fluctuated between 6,000 and 9,000 meters, degraded intermittently by low cloud and passing squalls. The individual at the center of this account was a surface lookout, rated seaman, assigned to the forward port watch. His station was the upper bridge platform, elevation approximately 6.4 meters above the waterline when surfaced. His primary duty was visual detection, horizon scanning for silhouettes, wake disturbances, mastheads, smoke, aircraft glint, or unnatural wave patterns. He carried no weapon during watch. Binoculars were standard 7x50 naval pattern, weighing 1.4 kilograms, rubber-armored, with individual focus and a 7.1-degree field of view. No radar repeater was available topside. Information from the radar room was relayed verbally through the bridge officer. At 5:42, the submarine completed its surface battery charge and maintained a steady course of 078 degrees. Speed, 12 knots. The conning officer ordered reduced speed at 6:10, dropping to 9 knots, to limit surface wake and exhaust plume as daylight strengthened. The lookout remained exposed to wind chill. Ambient air temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Spray froze intermittently on the railings. Gloves reduced tactile sensitivity, but removal risked numbness within minutes. At 6:58, sunrise occurred behind cloud cover. Light levels increased gradually rather than sharply. The sea took on a uniform slate color. Under these conditions, periscope sheens and low-profile hulls were difficult to differentiate from wave crests. The lookout adjusted binocular focus repeatedly, compensating for moisture on the lenses and salt residue. Each scan followed a disciplined pattern. Left to right across 180 degrees, horizon down to mid-distance, then back again at a slower pace. Each cycle took approximately 45 seconds. Enemy doctrine in this sector emphasized air patrol saturation during daylight and night surface hunter-killer groups. Aircraft commonly approached from astern at low altitude, exploiting exhaust visibility and silhouette contrast. The submarine therefore maintained zigzag intervals of 20 minutes, altering course by 10 to 15 degrees each time. At 7:34, a weather front approached from the northwest. Barometric pressure fell steadily. Cloud base dropped to approximately 400 meters. These conditions reduced aerial threat probability, but increased risk of collision or close-range surface contact due to reduced visibility. The command decision was to remain surface until 9 o'clock, then submerge a periscope depth for the mid-morning transit. The lookout's fatigue was cumulative rather than acute. He had slept 3 hours and 20 minutes in the previous 24-hour cycle, interrupted twice by trim adjustments and a sonar contact drill. His vision remained functional but required conscious effort to maintain focus. Micro-errors, momentary overcorrection of binocular alignment, delayed refocusing, were present but managed. At 8:12, the radar room reported intermittent returns at 11,000 yards, bearing 041 degrees, inconsistent and likely weather clutter. No visual confirmation was possible. The bridge officer acknowledged but took no immediate action. The submarine continued on course. By 8:47, sea state increased to Beaufort 6. Swell height reached 4 meters. The bow began to bury intermittently, sending sheets of water across the forward deck. The lookout widened his stance to maintain balance. Each impact transmitted vibration through the bridge structure, briefly blurring the binocular image. At 9:03, the order prepare to dive was given. The submarine reduced speed to 7 knots. Lookouts intensified scanning, particularly forward sectors, to ensure a clear dive path. The fatal class of incidents in this patrol zone often occurred during the transition from surface to submerged operations, when attention was divided and maneuverability limited. At 9:11, With hatches still open and ballast tanks not yet flooded, the lookout detected nothing abnormal. The sea ahead appeared empty, broken only by wave tops and rain streaks. The sky darkened further. Light levels dropped to those typical of late evening rather than morning. At 9:14, the submarine held course 078 degrees, speed 6 knots, awaiting final clearance to dive. It was at this moment, second before the ballast vents would open, that the lookout scan reached the forward starboard quadrant again. He noted a linear disturbance against a wave pattern at approximately 1,200 yards, bearing 062 degrees. At first glance, it resembled a wave interference effect. He held binoculars steady rather than continuing the sweep. The disturbance persisted across multiple wave cycles. It maintained relative bearing despite the submarine's forward motion. Its length appeared inconsistent with natural swell behavior. The lookout adjusted focus and angle, compensating for glare and rain. The shape resolved gradually into a low, elongated form, darker than the surrounding water, intermittently obscured by wave crests. By 9:15, the object apparent closing rate exceeded expectations for a passive surface feature. The lookout estimated speed at 18 to 22 knots, significantly faster than any merchant vessel in these conditions. The bearing drifted left by 1 to 2 degrees, indicating a crossing trajectory rather than parallel motion. He did not shout immediately. Standard procedure required confirmation to avoid false alarms. He tracked the object for 5 additional seconds, long enough to note a brief vertical protrusion, possibly a mast or gun shield, visible for less than 0.4 seconds between wave crests. At 9 hours 15 minutes and 26 seconds, the lookout reported a fast-moving contact to the bridge officer. His tone was controlled. The bearing and estimated range were passed without embellishment. The bridge officer raised binoculars but saw nothing. Radar showed no return at that range due to sea clutter. At 9 hours 15 minutes and 38 seconds, the object's wake became unmistakable. White water appeared intermittently behind it, oriented diagonally across the submarine's bow path. The distance closed to approximately 800 yards. The estimated time to potential intersection dropped below 40 seconds. At 9 hours 15 minutes and 45 seconds, the bridge officer ordered an immediate crash dive. The command was transmitted below. The ballast vents opened at 9 hours 15 minutes and 49 seconds. The deck began to tilt as the bow pitched downward. The lookout remained topside until 9 hours 16 minutes and 2 seconds, when he descended through the hatch as water swept across the bridge. The submarine began its descent with an initial down angle of 8 degrees, speed 6 knots, propellers still turning. The last visual impression before the hatch sealed was the white trace of a weight cutting across the surface directly ahead. The emergency maneuver that followed was dictated by seconds, depth, and geometry. The lookout's observation had occurred just early enough to alter the sequence of events that would otherwise have ended the patrol and the vessel at the surface. The hatch sealed fully at 9:16. The bridge drained rapidly as the submarine passed beneath the surface. Ambient sound shifted from wind and water impact to the enclosed mechanical environment of the pressure hull. The lookout descended to control room ladder base and remained standing, awaiting reassignment, his role temporarily complete, but his report now driving events. The submarine passed 20 meters depth by 9:17. The bow planes were set to full dive. Stern planes followed 2 degrees later to stabilize angle. The down angle was reduced from 8 degrees to 5 degrees to prevent excessive descent rate. The diving officer ordered speed increased to 10 knots to gain control authority over planes. Electric motors delivered power smoothly, but battery load increased sharply. At 9:18, Sonar reported a high-speed surface contact passing across the bow sector. The acoustic signature was now clear. A screw beat consistent with a small escort vessel, estimated displacement between 1,200 and 1,500 tons, likely a corvette or a fast patrol craft. Propeller cadence suggested 2 shafts, not a trawler conversion. Cavitation was present, indicating speed in excess of 18 knots. The geometry was unfavorable. The escort's track intersected the submarine's projected dive path. Had the dive commenced less than a minute later, the crossing would have occurred at the surface. At periscope depth, it would have resulted in immediate visual detection. Now, at shallow depth, the risk shifted to sonar acquisition and depth charge attack. At 9:19, depth reached 35 meters. The diving officer ordered planes to neutral briefly, then adjusted to maintain a controlled descent to 50 meters. The intent was to pass beneath the escort's probable sonar cone, which, given sea state and speed, would be degraded but still effective in the upper layers. Water temperature at this depth was 8 degrees Celsius, slightly warmer than the surface due to recent weather instability. A weak thermocline existed around 55 to 60 meters, insufficient for full acoustic masking, but capable of distorting range estimation. At 9:20, the escort's propeller noise intensified, indicating proximity rather than approach. Bearings shifted rapidly from starboard forward to starboard beam. The relative motion suggested the escort was unaware of the submarine at that moment, continuing on its own course rather than maneuvering to intercept. This assessment changed at 9:21. Sonar detected a reduction in escort speed. Propeller cadence dropped. The sound profile altered from transit mode to search mode. The escort began a shallow turn to port. This indicated that the submarine's crash dive had been detected indirectly, likely through surface disturbance, wake intersection, or ballast vent noise transmitted through the water. The submarine reached 50 meters depth at 9:22. Speed was reduced to 6 knots to limit self-noise. The diving officer ordered a gradual descent to 80 meters, targeting the lower edge of the weak thermal layer. Trim adjustments were made incrementally. Each change reduced slight hull creaks as pressure increased. Inside the control room, lighting was reduced to red. Non-essential movement ceased. Crew members adopted fixed positions. The lookout, now off watch, remained standing against the bulkhead, breathing controlled, hands steady. His role was observational no longer, but his earlier detection defined the unfolding tactical problem. At 9:23, the escort completed its turn and passed over the submarine's estimated position. Sonar registered hull noise above, then astern. No active sonar pings were detected yet. This suggested the escort was relying on passive listening initially, possibly uncertain of contact classification. At 9:24, the first active sonar ping was heard. Frequency was consistent with Allied ASTIC sets of the period, medium frequency, optimized for shallow water search. The ping returned with a faint echo, insufficient for precise range. The escort adjusted course again, tightening its turn radius. Depth reached 70 meters by 9:25. The submarine leveled off briefly. The commander ordered speed reduced further to 3 knots, accepting reduced maneuverability in exchange for lower acoustic signature. Motors were adjusted to minimize harmonics. Loose items were secured. The escort sonar pings continued at irregular intervals. The spacing suggested the operator was adjusting settings, attempting to resolve contact through clutter caused by the rough sea and thermal instability. Each ping produced a dull metallic echo through the hull, followed by silence. At 9:26, the escort altered speed again, increasing to an estimated 12 knots. This degraded its own sonar performance, but allowed it to reposition. The maneuver indicated uncertainty rather than confident tracking. The submarine's earlier emergency dive had disrupted what would have been a clean interception geometry. At 9:27, the submarine descended to 90 meters. Hull pressure increased. Minor seepage was reported at a forward packing gland within acceptable limits. The commander elected not to go deeper yet, conserving depth margin for later evasion if required. The escort crossed the submarine's wake path again, this time further astern. Sonar contact weakened. No depth charges were deployed. This suggested that the escort had not achieved a firm firing solution. At 9:28, acoustic conditions shifted. A second set of propeller noises appeared at long range, bearing north-northeast. This was likely another escort responding to a general patrol pattern rather than a confirmed contact. Enemy doctrine in this sector favored mutual support, but avoided overconcentration without positive identification. At 9:29, the first escort resumed active pinging, but now at longer intervals. The submarine maintained course 078 degrees, depth 90 meters, speed 3 knots. The crew remained silent. No internal communication occurred beyond essential control commands. The pressure of waiting dominated this phase. Minutes passed without visible change, but each sonar return carried potential escalation. The lookout, now seated on the deck plates, replayed the visual pattern he had seen. The unnatural wake, the brief vertical shape. He understood, without articulation, that the timing of his report had shifted the engagement from surface collision to subsurface pursuit. At 9:30, the escort's noise began to fade gradually. Bearing drifted aft. Sonar ping ceased entirely. The second contact remained distant and did not close. The immediate threat diminished, but the patrol environment remained hostile. The submarine continued submerged transit, aware that detection could recur at any time. The impossible emergency maneuver, the crash dive initiated seconds before intersection, had succeeded not by evasion alone, but by forcing the enemy into uncertainty rather than decisive action. The phase concluded not with resolution, but with suspended tension. The sea above remained occupied by hostile forces. The submarine below proceeded cautiously, depth steady, noise minimal, the outcome still unresolved. By 9:31, the submarine had settled into a steady submerged transit. Depth remained constant at 90 meters. Speed was held at 3 knots. Electrical load stabilized. Internal temperature rose gradually as ventilation was restricted. Condensation formed along exposed piping and hull frames. Sonar maintained passive listening only. The hydrophone operator reported residual surface noise from the primary escort at extended range, bearing aft and decreasing in intensity. The second contact remained intermittent and distant. No active sonar emissions were detected during this interval. At 9:34, the commander ordered a minor course adjustment to 070 degrees, altering the submarine's acoustic profile relative to the last known escort track. The turn was executed slowly over several minutes to avoid transient noise spikes. Rudder angle did not exceed 5 degrees at any point. At 9:36, depth was increased incrementally to 100 meters. This placed the submarine below the weak thermal boundary identified earlier. Acoustic conditions improved marginally. Surface-generated noise attenuated. However, the deeper depth reduced available margin should emergency maneuvering be required later. The lookout, reassigned temporarily to auxiliary duties, assisted with monitoring hull fittings in the forward compartment. His movements were controlled and deliberate. The mental transition from visual detection to enclosed confinement was evident in his posture and breathing, but no overt signs of stress were displayed. At 9:40, sonar detected renewed active emissions. The ping frequency differed slightly from the earlier contact, suggesting the second escort had begun its own search pattern. Bearing was north-northeast, range uncertain but closing slowly. The commander assessed that the earlier near collision had triggered a broader alert, even if no firm contact had been established. At 9:42, the submarine reduced speed to 2 knots. This further limited self-noise but reduced hydrodynamic control. Trim was adjusted carefully to maintain depth. Minor ballast transfers were conducted over several minutes to avoid audible flow noise. The escort's sonar pings continued at regular intervals. The spacing suggested a methodical sweep rather than a reactive attack. Enemy doctrine emphasized barrier searches following suspected submarine dives, particularly in choke points and transit lanes. At 9:45, the escort altered course. Sonar bearing shifted slightly to the east. The submarine held course in depth, accepting the risk of temporary alignment rather than introducing noise through maneuver. At 9:47, the sonar operator reported a stronger echo return following a ping. The contact classification was uncertain, but warranted caution. The commander ordered all non-essential electrical systems secured. Lighting was reduced further. The internal environment became noticeably quieter, amplifying perception of each external sound. At 9:50, the escort closed to an estimated 1,800 meters. Active sonar intensity increased. The ping reverberated through the hull structure, producing a metallic resonance that decayed slowly. The echo characteristics suggested the escort was sweeping vertically as well as horizontally, attempting to resolve depth. The submarine responded by descending slowly to 110 meters by 9:52. This maneuver was executed over several minutes, with planes adjusted minimally. The goal was to exploit uncertainty in depth estimation rather than evade laterally. At 9:54, the escort reduced speed. Propeller noise softened. This indicated preparation for potential attack rather than transit. The sonar pings shortened in interval. The search pattern tightened. At 9:56, the first depth charge detonation occurred. It exploded at an estimated 70 meters, approximately 400 meters distant. The shock wave reached the submarine as a dull thud, followed by a low-frequency hull vibration. No damage was reported. The charge depth suggested an imprecise estimate, likely based on partial sonar contact. At 9:58, 2 additional depth charges detonated in sequence, staggered laterally rather than vertically. The pattern was exploratory rather than concentrated. The submarine maintained depth and course, avoiding reactive maneuvers that might reveal position through noise. At 10:01, the escort passed overhead. Hull noise was audible directly above, accompanied by cavitation as speed increased briefly. Sonar ping ceased during the pass, consistent with standard attack run procedures of the period. At 10:03, no further detonations occurred. The escort moved away on a diverging course. Sonar contact weakened. The commander assessed that the enemy had not achieved a reliable fix and was disengaging to resume broader patrol. At 10:06, the submarine increased speed slightly to 3 knots and altered course to 062 degrees, placing it further off the original transit line. Depth was maintained at 110 meters. The immediate engagement phase concluded without damage, but the psychological and operational effects were significant. The lookout's initial detection had forced an emergency dive that disrupted the enemy's approach geometry. The subsequent depth charge attack, though brief, confirmed that the submarine had been within lethal range only minutes earlier. By 10:10, sonar reported no active emissions within immediate range. Passive noise diminished steadily. The patrol continued under heightened caution, the crew aware that the margin between survival and destruction had been measured in seconds at the surface and meters below it. At 10:12, the submarine stabilized on its new course. Depth remained 110 meters. Speed was held at 3 knots. Battery consumption was recalculated and logged. The commander accepted the increased electrical load in exchange for continued separation from the earlier patrol axis. Sonar maintained passive monitoring. Background noise was dominated by sea state rather than machinery. The earlier escorts were no longer audible. This absence did not indicate safety. It reflected distance and masking rather than disengagement. At 10:18, a faint, intermittent propeller signature appeared at extreme range to the west. The acoustic profile differed from the earlier escorts. It was slower, lower frequency, consistent with a larger vessel operating at reduced speed. No active sonar accompanied it. The contact was assessed as a merchant ship or auxiliary, possibly routed to the same corridor. The commander elected not to pursue. The patrol priority was survival rather than engagement. The submarine maintained depth and course, passing beneath the likely track rather than attempting interception. At 10:26, internal fatigue became more apparent. Crew posture slackened slightly. Movement slowed. Condensation increased on bulkheads as temperature differentials stabilized. The lookout, now resting on a bench in the forward compartment, remained alert but physically constrained by the prolonged confined posture. At 10:34, sonar detected renewed active emissions, this time from multiple bearings. The pings were not synchronized. Frequencies varied slightly. This indicated a coordinated search rather than a single vessel sweep. Enemy doctrine following an uncertain contact often involved dispersing escorts along predicted submarine movement vectors. At 10:37, the submarine reduced speed to 2 knots. Planes were adjusted to maintain depth with minimal control input. Trim changes were executed using forward tanks rather than rapid ballast transfers to reduce noise. At 10:41, the first escort sonar bearing stabilized in the northwest. A second ping source appeared to the south. The geometry suggested a converging pattern designed to bracket a suspected contact area rather than pursue a known target. At 10:45, depth was increased to 125 meters. Hull stress indicators remained within tolerance. The commander judged that deeper operation would complicate enemy depth setting while preserving sufficient reserve below. At 10:49, active sonar pings intensified. Echo return strengthened intermittently, likely due to multipath effects rather than precise localization. The submarine remained motionless relative to the water mass for several minutes, allowing currents to carry it laterally. At 10:55, the first depth charge of this phase detonated at an estimated 100 meters, distant but closer than earlier attacks. The shock wave produced a sharper hull response. A light fixture in the aft compartment loosened but remained functional. At 10:58, two more charges followed, offset fore and aft. The pattern was more deliberate. Enemy adaptation was evident. Depth settings have been adjusted downward based on earlier inconclusive results. The submarine responded by descending gradually to 140 meters by 11:02. Speed remained 2 knots. Control inputs were minimized. The hull emitted low, intermittent creaks as pressure increased. At 11:05, the escorts passed overhead in succession. Sonar pings ceased during the passes. Propeller noise varied, suggesting different vessel classes or propulsion settings. No charges detonated during this interval. At 11:10, active sonar resumed but at longer intervals. The spacing suggested reduced confidence in contact. One escort altered course sharply, increasing speed, likely repositioning rather than attacking. At 11:14, sonar contact weakened across all bearings. The converging pattern loosened. The commander assessed that the escorts were transitioning from attack mode to area denial, maintaining presence without concentrated effort. At 11:18, the submarine altered course to 050 degrees, executing the turn over several minutes. Depth remained 140 meters. This placed the vessel beneath a different current layer, increasing lateral displacement without propulsion noise. At 11:24, internal checks reported no structural compromise. Minor seepage remained stable. Battery levels were reduced, but sufficient for continued submerged operation. At 11:30, sonar detected only distant surface traffic and weather noise. No active emissions were present within effective range. The escalation phase ended not with decisive action, but with gradual dissipation of pressure as enemy forces redistributed. The adaptation on both sides was evident. The enemy had adjusted depth settings and search geometry. The submarine had traded speed and operational flexibility for depth, silence, and time. The lookout's initial observation continued to shape every decision, its implications extending far beyond the surface moment when it occurred. By 11:32, the submarine had been submerged continuously for more than 2 hours. Depth was held at 140 meters. Speed remained 2 knots. The internal environment had stabilized into a steady, constrained rhythm. Low light, reduced sound, minimal movement. The decisive period did not announce itself through dramatic change, but through accumulation of small, constrained decisions. At 11:36, sonar reported a single distant propeller contact to the west-southwest. The acoustic signature was faint and irregular. No active sonar accompanied it. The contact was assessed as non-hostile or at least non-searching. The commander elected to maintain current parameters. At 11:42, the submarine crossed beneath a minor thermal boundary. Water temperature dropped by 1.5 degrees Celsius over 10 meters of depth. This introduced slight acoustic distortion, further degrading surface detection capability against the submarine. The commander ordered depth maintained precisely within this layer. At 11:48, the lookout, reassigned to internal watch rotation, resumed a standing position near the forward bulkhead. His role was now purely passive. Fatigue manifested as slowed reaction to routine sounds, but situational awareness remained intact. The memory of the surface wake remained fixed and unaltered, a reference point against which all subsequent events were measured. At 11:55, sonar detected renewed active emissions at long range, bearing northwest. The pings were infrequent and low intensity. This suggested a distant patrol, rather than an active hunt. Enemy forces had not abandoned the area, but their posture had shifted. At 12:02, the submarine reduced speed to 1.5 knots. This further reduced noise, but increased reliance on trim stability. Minor adjustments were made using aft tanks. Control inputs were deliberate and spaced. At 12:10, battery levels reached a threshold requiring long-term planning. Continued deep operation would limit future maneuver options. The commander evaluated options: remain deep and silent, or begin gradual withdrawal towards safer waters under cover depth. At 12:18, the decision was made to alter course to 032 degrees, moving away from the primary patrol corridor identified earlier. The turn was executed slowly over 12 minutes, with rudder angle limited to 4 degrees. Depth was maintained. At 12:32, sonar contacts diminished further. Only distant, unspecific noise remained. No active sonar pings were detected within effective range. The decisive period concluded not with engagement, but with separation. The submarine had exited the immediate threat envelope created by the earlier near collision. At 12:45, depth was reduced slightly to 130 meters to conserve structural margin. Speed increased marginally to 2 knots. Internal conditions improved only minimally. The crew remained in a heightened but controlled state. The decisive outcome of the patrol segment was clear in operational terms. A surface intersection that would have resulted in immediate detection and likely destruction had been converted into a diffuse, inconclusive anti-submarine effort. The conversion had occurred because of visual anomaly recognized, evaluated, and reported with sufficient margin to act. By 13:10, the submarine had established a stable withdrawal track. Depth was held between 120 and 130 meters. Speed remained 2 knots. Sonar reported no active threats within immediate range. At 13:30, internal routines resumed in a limited form. Crew rotation was adjusted. Water and air quality were assessed. No damage requiring repair was identified. The submarine remained fully mission capable, though battery reserves were reduced. At 14:05, sonar confirmed clear water in all quadrants. The commander authorized a gradual ascent to 90 meters, conducted over 25 minutes. This maneuver was executed cautiously, with continuous monitoring for renewed surface activity. At 14:40, the submarine leveled off at 90 meters. Speed increased to 3 knots. The patrol continued under submerged conditions, now oriented towards safer operating areas. The lookout's role reverted to routine. No formal debrief occurred immediately. The significance of the earlier observation was understood implicitly rather than articulated. In submarine operations of the period, survival itself constituted validation. The consequences extended beyond the individual patrol. Enemy forces had been diverted, fuel expended, and patrol geometry disrupted without achieving confirmation or kill. The submarine retained initiative and mobility. The near collision remained unrecorded in enemy logs, appearing only as a fleeting uncertainty in sonar traces and wake disturbance. By March 18th, the patrol continued without further incident. The earlier emergency maneuver was logged tersely. Contact sighted. Crash dive executed. Enemy search evaded. No embellishment was added. The factual record did not reflect the narrow temporal margin involved. What was proven was not a new tactic, but the continued relevance of disciplined observation under deteriorating conditions. A single lookout, scanning through spray and low cloud, identified a deviation from natural patterns with seconds to spare. The resulting maneuver altered geometry, timing, and outcome. No damage was sustained. No engagement was confirmed. The patrol continued.